You're listening to Wildlife Quests, a travel and wildlife podcast where we meet explorers, conservationists, and adventurers who go beyond. Join me as we uncover untold stories of nature, the people protecting it, and share the journeys that connect us all. My name's Will. I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today has been dubbed the Orangutan Whisperer. He's the founder and president of the Orangutan Project, an international charity that's raised over $25 million for orangutan conservation, saved hundreds of critically endangered orangutans, buying and leasing land to protect it, and he's also the founder for the International Elephant Project, the International Tiger Project, and Forest for People. He's worked with orangutans for over 30 years and established the most successful breeding colony in the world. I welcome Leif Cocks. Okay, Leif, thank you first off for joining us today, and welcome. I would like, really, before we get into the world of orangutans, just to find out a bit about your background, your career path, and what led you to ultimately found the Orangutan Project.
I was brought up in a very dense metropolis, Hong Kong, one of the most densest populations in the world. So I guess really evidence of nature over nurture. So that environment should not be a love of nature and animals, but I always had that. And so always wanted to aspire to work closely with animals. And also I just didn't want to spend my life indoors in an office and watch life go by. Yeah. I wanted to be out amongst it. And after I came to Australia and finished university, working at the zoo was a natural first step for me to work with animals and also living my life in the outdoors.
How did that sort of come to fruition with you then finding that attraction to orangutans in particular?
This was many years ago. And so at the time, I wrote to the zoo, said, "You got a job for me?" And they wrote back 2 weeks later, said, "Yes, come in." And I became the first zookeeper that ever had a university degree. So it's very common now, but back then it wasn't. And after a while working there, the old orangutan keeper, Charlie Brofield, retired after many years. And they needed somebody to look after the 15 orangutans. And no one really actually wanted to do it. But I thought, wow, this is a fantastic opportunity. And the wonderful thing is that back in this time, there wasn't really any training. They gave me a diet sheet and told me how to open the doors and the slides. That was pretty much it. And there was no occupational health and safety back in those days. This was when men were real men and zookeepers were even more real than that. So no one told me that orangutans were supposed to be dangerous or whatever. So I just went in with them and had my lunch with them. You know, I was working with zebras and all sorts of other animals. And why wouldn't you just work with the orangutans and go in with them? So I was having my lunch and with them, looking after them. It was only later that I discovered that other zoos thought orangutans were dangerous things, that you should not enter their enclosures and keep a distance from them. But this gave me a fantastic opportunity to learn who they were without that authoritarian boundary that between prisoner and guard. And so, I got to learn to see them as persons and as personal friends of mine. And of course, that eventually led to the creation of the Orangutan Project, because I came to the understanding that orangutans are persons. They didn't belong in captivity, and they don't thrive in captivity, just like human persons don't do well in captivity. And of course, unfortunately, that they've been slaughtered as agricultural pests. Since the time I started working with orangutans until now, at least 200,000 have been murdered as their rainforests have been destroyed and they've been macheted and burnt alive. That kind of then set the stage for starting the Orangutan Project and the other projects, the tiger, elephant, in order to try to save the orangutans in the rainforest before it's too late.
I'm assuming you went where the action was and you just took that leap to move to Indonesia and get amongst it there to really make that change happen. Is that what happened?
Yeah, well, two things happened. I went back to my university Kurt University and said, I want to study
Okay.
orangutans. And luckily I found a great supervisor called George Newland who was willing to take me on. And so I started my research in primate behavior, then orangutans. And then at the same time, on my leave, I would go up into Borneo and help rescue orangutans. Um, and building up my understanding knowledge as well as practically helping orangutans. And then
Sure.
eventually it came a time when, I left the zoo because the organization and the need was so great that it became my full-time occupation.
I think the most two common species people are familiar with would be the Sumatran and the Bornean orangutan. So it'd be good just to get your professional understanding of what the key differences around the personality traits, but also the visual traits.
Yeah, interested because often people say, I know about orangutans or something. And there's three species of orangutans, and we're talking about, in this case, the Bornean
Yeah,
and Sumatran ones. And they're more different to each
yeah,
other than chimpanzees and bonobos. So, and behaviorally and ecologically. And so to say, I know about orangutans is like saying, maybe you don't, because they're
yeah,
extremely different. And it all actually is quite interesting. It all comes down to geology. In Sumatra, you have volcanic soil, so it's rich and fertile. And so you have a high concentration of fruiting trees. In Borneo, you have old, ancient alluvial soils with very low nutrients. So you have very much lower density of nutrients in food. And this is common with many primates. The Sumatran went down the route of why don't we build this big brain to develop these and adapt to the environment through culture. And, and through culture, we learn how to find the food, find the medicines, and avoid the dangers. Yeah? And that works really well. And what they do is they find high packets of high energy foods called fruit. Now, on the other side, in Borneo, the Bornean orangutans, to a different degree, not as much as, let's say, a gorilla who's on the extreme end, they had to go a different route and say, instead of putting all the energy into having these big brains, we'll go and have bigger guts and we'll eat more vegetation and leaves. And you can't build a big brain, I guess, on a very high leaf diet, but you don't need a big brain to eat leaves. And so they
sure.
went down the different route. And this has all sorts of, we obviously not the time to go all into different things. For example, the interbirth interval in Sumatran orangutans is 9 years, where the Pongo pygmaeus morio, the most subspecies of Borneo orangutan, is down to 4 years, which means basically that they're having shorter maternal periods, less transfer of culture, but more reliant on large hind guts to ferment vegetation. And these things really do matter. And you mentioned about the Sumatrans have longer, they're more gracile and lighter in color. The Borneo orangutans tend to be darker, more robust in nature, and a lower of intelligence, like comparing Neanderthals and maybe early humans. And then the
Yeah.
decline going from the west to the east of Borneo. And you can't just put the wrong orangutan in the wrong environment because they're actually designed for very different environments. So understanding what you're dealing with is one of the key things necessary to their survival, protecting populations, and of course, the reintroduction of rescued orangutans.
Leads me on to, you mentioned the third species, which I wanted to talk about as well, because I find it amazing that the Tapanuli orangutan species was only discovered in
Mhm.
2017. Now, how does that happen? Is it because we thought that it was a Sumatran, for example? Or was it because it was just not studied enough
Mm,
to really understand that separation and then declaring it a species in itself?
yeah. No, again, it's very interesting. I'm trying to give you the snap summary. So we thought there was no orangutans population existing south of Lake Toba in Sumatra. And this is mainly because in north of Lake Toba, they converted to Islam. And South Lake Toba, they tend to convert to Christianity. And orangutans being bushmeat is not halal. So all the orangutans seem to have survived north of Lake Toba when you had Islamic populations, and south of Lake Toba with just very low levels of hunting, because you only kill 1% of orangutan population a year is spirals to extinction. It's just low level hunting by people who didn't have any religious dictate against killing wildlife, slowly hunted to extinction. And so this is when I started working with orangutans, that was the common understanding. Now, we went in there. I went in there with one of the scientists who described this new species, Matt.
Mm.
And it was like hills. You know, you watch those King Kong movies, there's dramatic hills that go up like this.
Sure.
And it was hot. It was dreadful getting in that magnificent, beautiful rainforest. But to get in there was really hard. And
Untouched, no paths, and
exactly.
unexplored, really. Yeah.
And there were these orangutans. They looked like Sumatran, but not quite. They had beards, different faces. And what had happened is because this was so hilly and treacherous, hunters never went in there. There was always an easier place to hunt, or let's just do agriculture instead. And so they survived because the land was just so hospitable that Christian diets just could be bothered going, and the cost benefit just simply wasn't there. But the most interesting thing, what we discovered is that now about 75,000 years ago, there was Toba event. So middle of Sumatra, Lake Toba, the big Toba volcano, where the lake sits on top. And this basically was an extinction level event for the entire planet. And many anthropologists believe this actually may have reduced the human population down to a few hundred breeding pairs. Now, that's often, people have different opinions on that, but certainly it was so huge, they would have wiped out all wildlife pretty much on the island of Sumatra. And so what happened was, and this is true with all the fauna, because orangutans and many of these species are lowland species, they can't live in highlands. And so all the orangutans repopulated Sumatra either from land bridge from Peninsula Malaysia, or the gibbons and everything, and the orangutans and other wildlife south of Lake Toba came over the land bridge of the last ice age into southern Sumatra. So you do get this quite as distinct animals which are in south of more related to Borneo, north of Sumatra, more related to Peninsula Malaysia. And of course, now there's water in between. And so when they did the DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA in particular, which is the female DNA passed on from mother to daughter, there was no Sumatran DNA in them, even though they look far more Sumatran than Borneo. It's a case of parallel evolution. These are orangutans that came over from Borneo during the last ice age, and and basically it evolved south, but parallel to the Sumatran orangutans in north. Now, with the male DNA, there were a few brave male orangutans from the north did actually get in it and breed. So there was a very small percentage of Sumatran male DNA. But it's essentially, we discovered in the 21st century a new species of great ape that we didn't know existed. And they're totally different to the other orangutans that are living on the island of Sumatra. But unfortunately, 600 to 800 left, and their forest has been destroyed by mining and hydroelectrical dams, so as well as hunting now. So yeah, it's sad that we can discover new species of great ape in the 21st century, but it's also sad that as quickly we discover them, we may put them into extinction.
It's a good point, and I think it's incredible that we still discovered stuff 2017, but we're not discovering little insects here. We're discovering huge apes that have remained hidden,
Yeah.
and that's even more of a reason to look at this land and explore it before we destroy it. And that has to be a very good example of that.
The reality is because the Indonesian rainforest is one of the most biodiverse and therefore the most effective carbon stores on the planet, because these two things are intrinsically linked. And we are wiping out and driving species to extinction that we have never even discovered. Even before we can describe them for science, they're gone already. So, it's a tragedy of our times.
I'd like to just understand a bit about the project itself, actually, if we can. I mean, Perhaps we can start with, how do orangutans end up in your sanctuary or in your care?
Hmm.
And perhaps we can just talk a bit about the rescue mission
Hmm.
from an orangutan which was potentially illegally held,
Hmm.
how he ended up coming to you. How do you get the information as well about locating these
Hmm.
orangutans?
Yeah. The first thing to say, look, the main game is to conserve the last
Mm.
viable ecosystems, the right type, shape, and size of rainforest. And it had to be the right type, shape, and size. Just saving bits of forests and anywhere just doesn't work. Because rainforest creates its own humidity and temperature. And on the edge of rainforest, up to a kilometer, you lose up about half your biodiversity due to the edge effect. And the orangutans and tigers and elephants and indigenous communities, they can only exist in lowlands. They're just conserving the hills and the mountains, which people love to conserve because it's good for water catchment and no one else wants it. Is not going to save any species. So we're piecing together now these last viable ecosystems by leasing, protecting, and sometimes purchasing the land to piece together ecosystems the right type, shape, and size. Now, some of them are, like in Bukit Tigapula, we've been working for some time. The orangutans went extinct in the 1830s. And so we're supporting the reintroduction of an extinct species. And then in Borneo, we're conserving a large ecosystem there. And the area has existing wild population. However, it's greatly reduced from hunting from the diet community. So it's below holding capacity and we're very patchy. And so what we're doing is, because the orangutans, the forest has been destroyed, they killed the agricultural pests, the ones not killed are starving. And therefore we need to have been rescuing them, translocating them, or rehabilitating them if that is required. And because people think, that look, if you cut down a bit of rainforest, can't they just survive in the rest, right? They know what they're doing, they're smart. But that just doesn't make any sense from a biologist point of view, because all species has more offspring than can survive. That's how all species need to operate in evolutionary terms. And we orangutans just don't like dying. So you'll find humans will spread out to the far reaches of habitable land on the globe to survive. They won't just sit there and go, we're just going to sit in this beautiful tropical rainforest and get killed because it's better than down the road. We'll move down the road if that's what it takes for us to survive. So if you get an ecosystem, it's be full of orangutans. And it's only in cases where there's hunting that population will be below holding capacity. But that's paled in insignificance to the industrial scale clearing of rainforests. And so the orangutans just simply don't have enough food to survive anymore in many cases. And so although translocating or rescuing orangutan sucks, because you're translocating their environment, their cultural adaptation to the forest, it's something that you really shouldn't want to do at all. But unfortunately, in most cases, it's the only way the poor orangutans can survive. And yeah, so our teams get or are searching themselves, especially in these coal mining areas where we know they're destroying the land, and at every opportunity, rescuing the starving and injured orangutans and the orphans to the care centers that we fund and run. And then hopefully we get as many of them back into the rainforest as possible, getting the best chance to live free in the wild, live with dignity. But we're starting a new kind of place called a sanctuary. This is not, because normally up until now, people saying, oh, okay, they go back to the wild or live in a zoo-like situation, sit in a cage, don't breed them, and they die. What we want to do now is to keep them in rainforests, large rainforest enclosures that we feed and support them, and allow them to live with dignity and breed. And their offspring will then go back to the wild. So you get the best welfare outcome, but also they can contribute to survival of their critically endangered species. So it's a win-win solution. That gives you some idea of
Yeah,
I guess, the holistic approach we're doing with orangutan conservation.
that's amazing. I was reading about the orangutan school, as you call it, how they go up from stages depending on their background and how they ended up with you, and how you're slowly reintroducing them to, to find their own food, to fend for themselves. to the point where you can hopefully release them. I just thought that was a completely brilliant
Yeah.
setup that you had. It was excellent watching
And,
that.
and, and it's hard because you don't have to start a reintroduction program for a cat or a tiger because that's why we have all these feral cats around the place. The average
Yeah.
moggy without any help just goes out, becomes feral because they're born with hardwired brains with instinct, very little cultural learning. You know, orangutans the opposite. They're born with vacant brains and need long maternal periods. And so the difficulty we have is we have these orangutans with vacant brains. They're extremely smart, but they don't have the cultural programming because their mothers were killed and they're taken away from their natal forest. And so we have to do our best through mixing orangutans with different skill levels and due to the skills of our technician is to program at least the rudimentary amount of culture into these young orangutans to give them a really good chance of surviving and reestablishing the extinct populations.
Do you get much pushback from if you were to go into a situation where you're removing this orangutan from someone that's either trying to sell it in the illegal trade or that's purchased it and you're actually taking that back? What's that conflict like? Do you work with the government or
Yeah.
the police as well
Yeah.
to make sure that's smooth? Because that can be, I'm assuming, quite dangerous as well to go out to these
Yeah.
places.
We always work with the proper government officials who, it was under their authority that the rescue centers are run and their authority and direction for orangutans are rescued and brought back. But the political situation is complex. There's 5 levels of
Yeah.
government and some government officials are wonderful people and some are mafia crooks. And so it is an eclectic mix. And so there's no simple
Yeah.
answer. My wonderful staff have get beaten up regularly and threatened and put their lives on the line to save these young orangutans. So it's unfortunately because the people who are destroying the rainforest for short-term gain to line their pockets at the expense of everybody else are powerful. And that's just not unique to Indonesia.
Yeah.
Powerful people control the political process and even law enforcement process I would say the majority of countries in the world.
I was looking at some of the black market wildlife trade that goes on in Jakarta, for example, and I know orangutans fall victim of that as well. There's a lot of complexities around that, and I guess you have to battle that as well.
Yes, but the law is quite simple. One thing you need to do to save orangutans in the forest is uphold the law. Orangutans have been illegal to kill or keep in the pets since 1956. It's illegal in Indonesia
Yeah.
to disturb a nest of an endangered species. An orangutan makes nests in the rainforest. It's just that
Yeah.
those laws aren't upheld, and powerful
Yeah.
people can get those laws ignored. And when you do get them to court and justice, it's seen as a victimless crime. We knocked down the rainforest. What was that? Sure, they killed these orangutans. But no, did any humans get hurt? And this is one of the reasons that I, for example, testified in Argentina to the court to give human rights to the orangutans there, and also helped give advice to give human rights to orangutans in Spain. That seems like an obscure sideline for a conservation in the field. But I believe in the long run, understanding and
Mhm.
raising the non-human persons on this planet to having this to rights in line with humans is one of the fundamental ways we can help protect them.
How was that received
And
out of interest, noticing that level of being to have a voice?
so, for example, Argentina progress and Spain make progress. Now, to be cynical, why? Because they don't have much investment in great apes, right? Yeah, give them
Mhm.
rights, right? India has given human rights to dolphins for similar reasons. What's the economic harm for that? But when you go to, let's say, America, where they have all these chimpanzees in these labs which are doing medical experiments and then range states, they think, God, if we give human rights to these animals, that's going to slow down business and the exploitation of the environment. And so the powerful resist these changes. But we have to somehow to save the planet because the destruction of the rainforest in Indonesia is intrinsically linked to climate change and needs to be addressed amongst all the other actions in order that we can effectively mitigate the worst of climate change. And yeah, we have to obviously mature enough not only give rights to orangutans and other great apes as fellow persons, but all the maturity to say we don't mind people using their talent and their abilities to become rich in selling goods and services that value improve humanity. But these people getting rich by destroying the future of the planet for all wildlife, indigenous communities, and future generations, we've got to just say no to that, unfortunately.
One thing which I thought was amazing that the Orangutan Project had done, which I was reading about, was that you were, from my understanding, was getting a bit frustrated with the speed to react from the government in terms of protecting land. So you actually leased 34,000 hectares of land, which was, I think it's a former logging site, is that
Mhm.
right? And then you turned that, rewilded it, and now you've turned that into a safe haven, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. And since then, we've also leasing and working with companies for protecting hundreds, 200,000 hectares, and have more in line to do that. And yet the reason is the government looks at rainforests and says, why don't we create these nature reserves in the hills, in the mountains, because we need water catchment for our cities, and nobody wants it. The palm oil people don't want pulp paper, it's too hilly. So yay, we'll save wildlife. But as I mentioned before, that ain't going to do it because they don't live there. 80% of orangutans, tigers, and elephants don't live in protected areas. They don't live in primary forest. They live in logged forest, yeah, which is unprotected. So this is what we raise the money and we lease it just like a palm oil company would or a pulp paper company lease it. And then we protect it and restore it. And yeah, unfortunately, people say, oh, the government should do it. I agree. It should be the government's responsibility to look after the land for the future generations and prosperity of their people. But they're not doing it. And there won't be nothing left. There won't be any viable ecosystem left if we, as concerned citizens, don't step up to the mark and save these last viable ecosystems. Of course, we hope in the long run, after we no longer on this planet, governments will be enlightened enough to say, gee, it was a great idea that these private people decided to save all these ecosystems because now our people, our country, and the climate, world climate can benefit from it.
So I wanted to understand interacting really with orangutans. You yourself have had lots of physical
Yeah.
interactions. So I'd be really keen to find out about if the do's and don'ts with orangutans, how you are seen. Do they recognize you as an individual?
No, they recognize individuals. And of course, I recognize individual orangutans. It's just a bit like maybe someone goes to China for the time, they all look alike. They don't look all alike because you haven't got the search image and understanding of that cultural face. So for an orangutan guy, yeah, they all look different. And actually, I can pick family resemblance. This is how long I've been working with. Oh, yeah, you must be
Yeah.
her son because you look like her. Yeah, and this is one of the why people think, oh, if humans care and nurture for them, aren't they going to be imprinted and think, oh, humans are nice and not avoid them? No, because they understand the difference. They have good people and bad people, and they like these ones, these are my friends, and those are strangers, and I'm wary of them. And so just like that. And orangutans range from like geniuses to dumb to aggressive to passive, the whole range. They just because they have individual personalities, just like humans. And you dig down, if that makes sense. So it's a bit like we can talk about general characteristics of humanity, of humans. Um, but my God, there's a surprising array of humans and personalities and types. And that's just the same with orangutans.
Have you ever had any negative experiences? I know orangutans don't generally have much aggression, but I guess any interactions where you've been bitten or hurt by an orangutan and what caused
Yeah.
that?
I think certainly orangutans are a more noble species than humans. And the example I give is we've killed over 1 million of them in my lifetime. Butchered them, shed them. and they're 7 times stronger than human beings, and the males have teeth like canines, like tigers. But there's not one case in a zoo or sanctuary on a wild orangutan ever killing a human being. So
Oh,
that's scorecard perfect. Now, that doesn't mean they
yeah.
can't be aggressive, yeah, and exert themselves. They just don't have that kill switch to just want to rip your face off and kill you like a chimpanzee or human would. So they're certainly able to use their aggression and their strengths in order to get what they want or protect themselves or exert themselves. And yeah, you certainly lose fingers or be badly bitten by orangutan if you don't manage those interactions properly. Yeah, and of course, working with orangutans for so long, I've had every range of experience with every range of orangutans. Yeah, it's a wonderful mosaic.
Amazing. Have you been bit before?
Not badly, mainly babies bite me.
Okay.
Yeah, they get to
But-
say they try to get you on. But it's interesting because they use it like to test you out and intimidate you. Just
Sure.
see who's going. This is what a lot of play behavior is: learning how to wrestle, interact, socialize, and to find out, you know, who's dominant. How far you can push the big male, how far you can push this before. So you're exploring your limits. And one of the tricks I learned with the young male orangutans when they get boisterous is I would just stick my hand in the mouth. I go,
Yeah.
"Oh,
Well,
you gonna bite it or not?" And they
yeah.
just go, "Oh, all right." Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
you're not afraid of me. Why keep trying? And so I guess that's a bit of a psychological trick I've used over the years with, especially young male orangutans, which is
Yeah.
as they get older, they get oysters and test themselves, which for me is a boy, which is fantastic, rough and tumble with young male
Yeah.
orangutans was one of the wonderful experiences of my life, as well as the
That's
nurturing, beautiful mothers and female orangutans. Both are beautiful.
that's incredible. Do you remember the first rehabilitation and then release into the wild? And what was that like? Because that must have been amazingly overwhelming
Mm.
being able to, rescue this animal and then nurture it back and then give it its life
Yeah.
back as well.
For a while, I've always been involved with maybe with an orangutan at one step, for example, the rescue or the care for it, being able to release. The first orangutan I ever was able to get experience from birth to independent wild was an orangutan called Tamara from Perth Zoo, where our president had a birth and was close friends with her mother. And then at the age of natural dispersion, took her to Sumatra. And through the release program there, we're able to support her through living in the wild and learning how to survive and eat until after 3 years she became independent.
So from the zoo, being born in the zoo to going back to the wild, that's almost unheard of. That's incredible.
Yeah, we had kind of a unique. Well, one is because my holidays and I had the orangutan project already started there, growing it, so we're already involved with the rescues and the release program. So I had the contacts and the knowledge and the great partners to support the process. But also, as I mentioned before, I was in a unique position. I used to go in with the orangutans. And I was with the mother, holding, playing with the baby orangutans with them and looking after them, cuddling them. And so when it came time to take her and put her in the jungle, it wasn't like, oh my God, what am I going to do? There's this huge orangutan and it's frightening. How do I get close to her? I've been with this orangutan all my life without any bars or protection. Now we're just in the rainforest together. And then so we can work together with the wonderful staff and technicians that help get her back into the wild.
One of my personal experiences, I visited Bukit Lawang in Sumatra, Indonesia, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Well, one of the things that really stuck in my mind was the drive getting to the location. So, just for the sake of the listeners, Bukit Lawang is a little village, and then it's basically borderlining with a large sanctuary there where you've got these orangutans, some wild, some rehabilitated there as well. And the drive towards Bukit Lawang, I remember either side, just palm oil plantations as far as your eye could
Really?
see. The real thing that stood out for me, I don't know if it was just that day in particular where they were doing a harvest, but I remember it was truck after truck going the opposite directions where we were going, done a harvest full of these palm oil fruit. And that was just, it was a shocking amount of deforestation. And then when I got to Bucket Luang, done the trek, experienced this amazing jungle, had this incredible experience where I was camping next to a river in the jungle, and an orangutan came down in the morning with its baby and had a drink from a river, and it's unforgettable. But then just thinking that palm oil plantation once upon a time would have looked like that jungle I just trekked in. And that was really, really moving actually for me. And it must be very hard for you as well to see this happening when you're constantly battling. So how do you manage your emotions, because you're running this professional project and you're trying to keep your emotions out of it, right? When it's a very motion driven project where you're going to get knocked back continuously. Have you managed to have this strong head now after doing it, I think, for 30 years?
No, and I don't believe in that bullshit. I believe in a strong
Okay.
heart. I don't believe in cutting off your
Mm.
emotions. I don't want to become an emotionless machine. And there's an
Mm.
intelligence in love and connectedness and understanding. I can only understand you and relate to you, communicate you most effectively if I love you, have empathy for you,
Mm.
and connection and sympathy for you. And no, the motivation is love. Why a mother loves her children. Is it a burden to love and protect and raise your children? No, it's mother's love, and that keeps you going.
Yeah.
Selfishness wears you out. I know orangutan conservation is interesting. All conservation, I'm assuming, is the same. It's been like, those
Yeah.
zombie movies, yeah, where you get this existential threat, which is the zombies eating people's brains. But if you watch the movies, who are the real dangerous ones? The Sheilas down the road.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's similar like that in conservation, because people try to reform the world without reforming themselves. And their ego is in a way. They want money, name, power, and fame. And they're all fighting each other, trying to underdo each other and etc. Because they have this hole in society trying to be filled with from the outside.
Yeah.
And they're less likely to criticize palm oil plantation pulp paper companies. One, they may be in pain, but also they're helping to become heroes. Every superhero needs a supervillain. And
Yeah.
that's just counterproductive. One of the reasons conservation projects are not as effective as they could be. But if we find love and empathy within our hearts, then we don't need that anymore. We don't need that ego trip, power trip. We become a supporter of everybody, and you have that resilience then. Because if you don't have the resilience, you collapse. Oh, I didn't get that. I didn't get that. And they get, they're going from one tragedy to another and they get exhausted. But love is unlimited. Love gives you the energy.
Was there ever an experience that really moved you and one you can't forget?
Many such instances. But I just want to highlight one of the most beautiful experiences I've had several times
Yeah.
is when I'm with an orangutan when it gives birth. Within 48 hours, the mother will get the little baby's hand and make it hold my finger. And you
Wow.
can look into the little baby's eyes and the mother connects it with you. And that's just, yeah, I've had the privilege of having that many times. And it's a wonderful connection with this new, beautiful person as it get into the world. And of course, orangutans come in with fingers missing and head injuries from machete, blind because they shoot their eyes out, and starving, barely a bag of bones. And so, unfortunately, horror stories, unfortunately, so numerous.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's quite incredible. And I guess that moment where the mother's allowing you to interact with its baby is because you've built trust as well over time. What can the individual do to help, day to day, but also to help the orangutan project?
Mhm. The answer is don't get sold on this thing, think globally, act locally, rubbish. And don't get sold on the idea that your individual actions can make a difference, that you should go palm oil free or do this, do that. That's just virtual signaling. And what the plan is, because, for example, the carbon footprint is invented by British Petroleum to put the emphasis on your personal actions, not them, which are destroying the planet, and disempower you. So you just go off and think you're saving the world by individual actions. Human beings have only ever achieved anything ever through collectivization. So what I would say is either collectivize your capital by giving money to a charity that's making a worthwhile contribution according to your values, or collectivize your labor by joining them. It's only through collectivization that we will ever achieve anything. And that'd be my main message, to collectivize your capital or your labor or both, and so join forces with others and with other individuals, other organizations, and then we will be able to make a significant difference.
You can start something on your own, but ultimately you need to work with other people because you can't do it all on your own. And I guess also for yourself, if you're needing to leave a legacy, ultimately this collection of people that you've hopefully formulated together can continue that, because you don't want it reliant, because in 10 years time, 50 years time, I'm sure you want to see a world where orangutans don't need that orangutan school and everything. They're just living in that protected area.
Exactly. We want to go out of business. That's our business model. That we want to get the job done, and so we want to be unemployed. And the other aspect that which you mentioned is the Orangutan Project achieved incredible things with saving hundreds of orangutans and conserving many forests. And yes, I'm ahead of that, but my really only skill is to bring on wonderful, talented, dedicated people into the team. That's a skill.
Yeah.
In essence, and it really becomes my particular personal skill or intelligence attitude becomes somewhat irrelevant. It's my ability to collectivize and bring together and support wonderful people under the umbrella of our conservation work, which I believe has made the results possible.
You're doing incredible work. I was reading about all the different projects you've got going on. And at some point, maybe in the future, I'd love to also talk about the tiger project as well. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, with elephants and the forest communities we're working with, all under the umbrella of our conservation work. And so, there's whole stories as well about all those different species and how we work with them in holistic conservation.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Leif. I really appreciate it. And thank you. And I'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye. If you're interested in learning more or supporting the Orangutan Project, head over to orangutan.org.au. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow or subscribe. Hit the bell icon if you're watching on YouTube, because I release weekly episodes. And if you've got a story you'd like to share, head over to wildlifequests.com and I'd love to hear your story. Until then, have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next episode.